Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is David Goldwyn, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, as well as chairman of the Energy Advisory Group. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion on the First Movers Coalition. Much of the technology key to the energy transition is not yet available at commercial scale. And to bring these innovations to market, cultivating demand is essential. This requires the alignment of policy and industry to both mobilize innovation and accelerate adoption. The First Movers Coalition, formally launched at COP26, is a U.S. government-led initiative driven by more than 30 major companies looking to do just that. Coordination at this level can serve as a potent catalyst for the change needed to reach 2030, and together these companies can push for broad commercialization of critical technologies. I'm delighted to be joined by a key representative of from the U.S. government and key movers from the private sector today to discuss the role of the coalition and the progress made thus far. It's my pleasure to introduce Varun Sivaram, Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation, to U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry, Lauren Riley, Managing Director of Global Environmental Affairs and Sustainability for United Airlines, and Pamela Vensky, Head of Corporate Affairs for Ørsted North America Offshore. Thanks very much to you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you. This event is on the record, and we are live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about today's discussion and share on social media using the hashtag ACEnergy and tagging us at AC Global Energy. Those participating via Zoom may submit questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the event, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Varun, let's start with you. Tell us about the First Movers Coalition. You're trying to bring these decarbonization technologies to market by creating market demand. How is it working? Are you pleased with the progress so far? And what are you hoping to accomplish?
Well, thanks so much, David, and thanks to everyone here at Atlantic Council for having me. And it's wonderful to be here with two founding members of the First Movers Coalition, Ørsted and United. You asked if we're pleased with the progress. We're thrilled. At COP26, President Biden, Secretary Kerry, along with the World Economic Forum, launched the First Movers Coalition. And in that launch, it was the biggest demand signal in history for emerging technologies, innovation in hard-to-abate sectors. These sectors account for 30+% of global emissions today, and if we don't do anything, they're going to account for a majority of global emissions on a business-as-usual path by mid-century. And so at COP, we had leading companies, United on the aviation side, Ørsted on the steel side as a major clean energy developer, and many others, Apple, Boeing, et cetera, Salesforce, join us, 35 companies, $6 trillion in market cap. Now, how does this all work? The reason this is such a big deal is that these companies did what we have previously done in other sectors to bring the modern miracles of society. We've had advanced market commitments that brought life-saving vaccines to market. We've had NASA make early purchase commitments that brought commercial spaceflight from SpaceX to market. And now we have clean energy technology commitments from companies like United and Ørsted that can bring these emerging technologies we'll need for decarbonization to market. We launched 4 sectors at COP26. We launched the steel sector. Ørsted made this commitment, along with automakers like Volvo, that 10% of the steel that they purchase would be near zero or zero carbon by 2030. Just for context, there's one steel plant in the whole world today in Sweden that can actually make fossil-free green steel. But this is the kind of demand signal, early market commitment, that can bring many more, dozens of plants online by 2030. In aviation, United Airlines and others led the way with the commitment to displace 5% of their jet fuel with technologies and fuels that will reduce emissions compared with jet fuel by 85% or more. It's better than any sustainable aviation fuel on the market today. They're really leading with this commitment. Others Amazon made a shipping commitment. 10% of its shipping would be zero carbon by 2030, and others made a trucking commitment. So what's the secret sauce here? Why will this work? In addition to the examples from vaccines and from spaceflight, there are a couple of reasons this could work. The first is, even though today some of these technologies are more expensive compared with their fossil fuel equivalents, down the value chain, when consumers finally buy the products, the cost difference is shockingly small. It costs pennies to buy a pair of jeans shipped on zero-emission ships, a couple $100 for a car with zero-emission steel. Second, because it's so low cost, this is literally the highest impact, highest leverage climate action any company can take. Because if you spend X amount of money on the First Movers Coalition, on buying down the cost in an early market of these technologies so that they will be deployed much faster and their innovation will progress, the cost per ton abated between now and mid-century is less than $1 per ton. That's cheaper than any offset you can buy. So we're very excited that our companies have joined us. Would love to have this conversation with you about why you joined and what you're excited about. And thanks, David, for convening this.
Terrific. Let me ask you about Ukraine. Obviously, with the crisis in Ukraine right now and skyrocketing energy prices, people are focused short term on getting gas supply. How does this impact the urgency for the First Movers Coalition to succeed?
Well, thanks for mentioning this. And of course, this event and everything we do right now is against this backdrop. Secretary Kerry spoke as the opening address at CERA Week last week at Houston, the biggest energy industry dialogue. And he called this a defining moment. So the administration is laser focused on rising to the challenge of this moment. And I think you've seen from the actions so far that we're up to the task. In terms of the First Movers Coalition in particular, there's an angle here. The First Movers Coalition, insofar as it attacks emissions in the steel industry, as well as upcoming sectors that we're going to announce later this spring, in aluminum, for example. Companies, particularly in Europe, that have announced or plan to announce that they will join the First Movers Coalition are going to be accessing supply chains that will reduce the dependence on imported fossil fuels. Fossil-free steel, for example, low-carbon or zero-carbon aluminum production. Europe, as you know, uses 25% of the gas it imports for industrial purposes. A third goes to power, 40% for heating buildings. And that industrial sector, as we start to decarbonize, will require technology innovation. And the First Movers Coalition is advancing that innovation to bring Europe and the rest of the world the solutions they need both for their climate goals and for energy security. And it's terrific that the private sector is out there leading on this front.
Terrific. Lauren and Pam, let me turn to you next. So we've heard the First Movers Coalition is trying to create a supply chain for these decarbonization technologies. How does this help you in your particular industries, and why are you all involved in it? Pam, let's start with you.
Well, I like to say Ørsted was a first mover before moving first was cool. So we're very happy to be here and really excited to be invited in as one of the first initiatives. You know, Ørsted's journey for transformation started 30 years ago when we built our first offshore wind farm in the North Sea. And, you know, our idea is similar to where oil and gas companies are today. We were looking to diversify, but we quickly realized that this could lead to the clean energy future that we wanted to build. So we're well on our way for internally being, our portfolio being net zero by 2025. We can do that. We can make that decision ourselves. Decarbonizing our supply chain, that is a really big challenge, and it's not something that we can do alone, one company. So when Varun and the Secretary invited us in, we knew that this was something that we had to be a part of in order to meet our commitments by 2040.
And thank you, David and the Atlantic Council, for having us today. And this is such an important conversation right now around decarbonizing hard-to-abate industries. And a deep appreciation to Varun and all of Secretary Kerry's team for your leadership in really coalescing and herding us cats together to say, hey, let's make a larger statement, because that's really where we are. It's about declaring what our North Star is and then building a roadmap to get there, which is what the First Movers Coalition has enabled us to do. So United Airlines, we do have a goal of net zero, but it's by 2050. As a hard-to-abate industry, one where we don't really have a readily available solution to use tomorrow to decarbonize aviation, we need these nearer-term benchmarks for us to declare and demonstrate progress in this roadmap towards net zero. And in particular, for United Airlines, our commitment to net zero is not relying upon the use of carbon offsets. So no harm against carbon offsets, they have a role in the marketplace, but for us, it was really about investing in those solutions, those technologies that enable permanent decarbonization. So we need these alternative fuels. We need these emerging technologies around electric aircraft and hydrogen-powered aircraft to enable our decarbonization journey. And for us, being a part of the First Movers Coalition, 5% of our jet fuel supply by 2030. So order of magnitude on that, it's about 250 million gallons of sustainable aviation fuel, high integrity sustainable aviation fuel that doesn't exist today. Well, in comparison, in 2019, which was our last year of normal flying, we consumed about 4 billion gallons of fuel. So we have a lot of work to do to really impact our entire footprint. In comparison to that 4 billion gallons, we only consumed 1 million gallons of sustainable aviation fuel in 2019. And we have some of the largest supply in all of aviation globally. So we have a lot of work to do, and we cannot do it alone. So working under the coalition, working across aviation, working across, frankly, the entire energy transition that's going to enable some of the sectors like ours to decarbonize, we need the renewable power. We need this transition to happen quickly so that it can help inform the next generation of alternative fuels that will allow us to decarbonize.
So you could go out on your own and try and put out a contract and ask for this, but it's hard to take that burden on by yourself. So what's the value add for a First Movers Coalition? How does it help you, in the marketplace?
So for us, I mean, we hear all the time, and I absolutely appreciate the sentiment that 2050 is just not relatable. So what does that mean to the average consumer, the average flyer? We also hear all the time from our corporate travelers that are looking at their Scope 3 emissions, and they're wondering how they can decarbonize their Scope 3 emissions. We're hearing from our investor community, and the SEC just had an announcement coming next week about disclosures and transparency and really demonstrating the financial impact of climate to your business. And so we're hearing all the way around our entire stakeholder sphere the importance of us setting nearer term goals. So by joining the First Movers Coalition, we are able to demonstrate that by 2030, if there's high integrity alternative fuels available, we, United Airlines, will commit to purchasing it. We will do it probably in collaboration with our corporate customers and or our peers or everybody that's willing to help in this transition, because we need everyone at the table to make this happen. But it allows us to demonstrate if we can hit this mile marker in 2030, we're hoping that those technologies and those fuels will begin to scale in a capacity that we just haven't seen yet.
And so just to build on this,
please.
I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead, and then I'll jump in. I do want to talk about the steel piece, but please.
Just quickly on aviation,
Yeah.
just to build on Lauren's response, the aggregate value of having companies like Lauren's join the First Movers Coalition is that even though United on its own, as Lauren said, is an order of magnitude so large they themselves could help to shape this market, you put them together with other consumers of fuel, and suddenly you have an advanced market commitment that is sizable enough that an innovator or an investor says, oh, I want to build that facility that produces this technology. It could be hydrogen, electric aircraft, or really advanced sustainable aviation fuels, synthetic fuels, for example, that as Lauren mentioned, just aren't on the market today. And they take that risk because there's a substantial enough commitment from United and its partners. And as Lauren said, we have some of United's customers on board. So Apple, for example, or Salesforce, in addition to United, making that commitment. So that's kind of the power. And the last thing I'll say is, from the US government side and from governments around the world, we're committed to helping these companies meet their commitments. Our Loan Programs Office is formally signed on. President Biden announced that our Loan Program Office at the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, the US Development Finance Corporation are all looking at ways to invest in the supply of projects for you to meet your demand commitments. Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
So how's
not
it work
at
on
all.
steel? Yeah.
No, it worked out perfect because we talk about the aviation side, and steel is a little bit different. What we're dealing with here is, the way we look at it, is it's a roadmap, and that's what we all need. 50% of our life cycle emissions for a wind farm come from steel. So that's a substantial number. What can we do to correct that? And so we're working right now with our steel partners, our supply chain partners, to look at near-term incremental change that we can do. Greater efficiency in production, circular approaches like recycled steel. Some of our partners are doing that now. But what doesn't exist today is net zero or even near zero steel for the steel plate market that we need, or product line that we need for the offshore wind industry. So we've got this opportunity to work together to write this roadmap and come together so these products are available when we need them.
Varun, let me come back to you because there are a lot of existing technologies that haven't yet been deployed that could really help with decarbonization, and then you have the futuristic, or at least the longer-term technologies. So how does First Movers Coalition strike the balance between pushing for near-term acceleration and for this medium-term deployment?
Yeah, look, this is a both-and discussion, right? In this decade, 80% of the reductions we need to achieve, and Secretary Kerry often talks about the 45% GHG percentage reduction this decade the world needs. 80% of that's going to come from existing technologies that are commercial or near commercial, right? Solar, wind, batteries, passenger electric vehicles. But at the same time this decade, we've got to put ourselves in position for the decarbonization of those hard-to-abate sectors. As Lauren was saying, this is the decade that we have to make some progress on the aviation sector. If Lauren's going to accomplish net zero by 2050 without offsets, that's an enormously ambitious target. And so that's why the First Movers Coalition is just one part of a constellation of administration and other efforts, right? There are clearly efforts. Anytime we go to a country, we go to India, Secretary Kerry goes to Indonesia, we're working with them to deploy clean energy as fast as humanly possible. But every time he speaks with companies, he also says the highest leverage action you can take right now is to devote just a little part of your supply chain to these emerging technologies. That, by the way, whether you're investing in a VC fund or you're investing, as Ørsted and United have also done, in the early demand for new technologies, highest leverage thing you can do for quite a limited amount of investment early on, because the effects will be felt for decades in the future. So again, it's a both and. I don't see a tension in between what we have right now and what we need to get to for net zero by 2050.
Let's come back.
And I would add on to that. I mean, I could not agree more that it's an everything on the table strategy at this point in time, because we can't afford, frankly, the time that it takes to get to perfect. And so today, when I'm asked to characterize what keeps me up at night, it is speed and it is scale. We need solutions now. We need them to be produced in a much, much faster pace than we've ever seen before. And we need it at a capacity that is unprecedented. And so we're going to start with, imperfect but good, and we'll work our way to perfect as the technologies mature over time. And the market demands, frankly, through these demand signals and other mechanisms, that we bring these solutions to market. But we have to move fast. And that's what First Movers Coalition helps us articulate, is that without this speed, the transition's never going to happen. And none of us will achieve the goals that we know we need to achieve economy-wide, globally, for us to be successful.
Well, so how's it going? You all had a big year. You had your first 100% sustainable aviation fuel flight. Thanks for inviting me and Randy Bell to come along on it. It was really exciting to be part of that. But how is the commercialization of sustainable aviation fuel going? And sort of in terms of your own decarbonization goals, what else is in the kit bag? What else are you working on?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have been heads down investing in decarbonization solutions for about a decade now. It is slow. It is quite slow, but it's promising, which is really what's so fascinating, is that the technology is known, the alternative fuel that we need is understood. It's just not available at the scale that we actually need to materially impact the emissions across aviation. So for United, just last year we made an investment in a startup company called Alder Fuels. They use biomass and advanced pyrolysis to make this really great potential sustainable aviation fuel that could potentially actually be a net zero fuel for us. So we're hopeful about that as part of it. Our commitment was to get the offtake for about 1.5 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel. So high integrity, sustainable aviation fuel, we're sending the demand signal, we will purchase. And so that's how, in working with your value chain and all of the folks across the entire spectrum of bringing these new solutions to market, we can play a role in that dialogue. I appreciate you coming to the flight in December. That was so much fun. It was really just a big party of climate people that care. But really what we showed then is that you can fly on 100% sustainable aviation fuel in our aircraft, where today there's a 50% limit. So if there is not that limit anymore and we're able to use 100% sustainable aviation fuel, the amount that we can pull down the emissions from flying is just so exciting. And so we're beginning to demonstrate these technical capabilities that have to go hand in hand with supply so that we're ready when the market can give us the solutions we need.
That's terrific. Pamela, same question on green steel. Sort of how is you want to buy this, but you've got to be it's got to be cost competitive. You can't be the most expensive, procurer in the marketplace. So what's the timeline for commercialization of green steel? And I know, Varun, you're going to want to come on this as well. And sort of, how do you see it? How do you see that moving?
Well, I'll start with, first, we too are taking an incremental approach. Let's find everything that's available now to take out that carbon intensity, but we're also investing in and have created a new business around e-fuels, which we're really excited about. We announced a partnership with Maersk to do e-fuels for the shipping industry. That also plays into an opportunity with the steel industry. So what we've done with our MOU with a steel producer in Europe is to say we can provide e-fuels to produce the power it takes to create the steel, but then we do a green steel power purchase from them or steel purchase from them. So it's kind of a circular approach that we feel really good about.
First movers in action.
Yeah.
This is so exciting. I mean, the amazing circularity here is Ørsted could produce the power that produces the fuel, hydrogen, that fuels the green steel plant, or is combined with captured carbon to fuel the United Airlines plane. Mm-hmm. Let me just say 2 words about technologies in each of these spheres. In the green steel sphere, as with all the other sectors, we're technology neutral. When our companies sign up for a First Movers Coalition commitment, the goal is emission reduction that is consistent with what we need in 2050. So it's not just like a little bit of emissions reduction, it's technologies that can really make the sector zero carbon. So in the steel sector, it could be a route like the plant in Sweden that is using green hydrogen in a direct reduction configuration to produce steel, or down the road, a company could meet its steel commitment using molten oxide electrolysis or another electrification route. So we're technology neutral so long as the technology actually reduces the emissions below the threshold. And those technical thresholds are listed on the First Movers Coalition website. In aviation, there's actually very few companies that understand the nuance as well as Lauren and United just articulated, which is, in the very near term, we've got a first generation of sustainable aviation fuels. Are they what we'll need in 2050? Probably not, right? They reduce half your emissions, let's say. But what United's doing to demonstrate that you can fly a plane on 100% of today's sustainable aviation fuels, big deal to build market acceptance. And then United's also got investments in the next generation. Lauren mentioned Alder Fuels, for example. United also has this great purchase order for hydrogen planes. Down the road, you're going to need technologies that actually get you to zero or near zero carbon. But this stepwise approach where you're building market acceptance using today's solutions, and then you're building the demand for tomorrow's solutions, that's this remarkably nuanced approach that we're so lucky to work with companies like yours that are doing the both and approach.
Let's talk about the role of policy, because it's terrific that your companies are out there and you're taking those first steps and you're making the investments, but not everybody in your industries is doing the same thing. And so what's the role of policy, particularly US policy, either regulatory policy or legislation, in helping to drive this and enable all of your peers to do it so that you're cost competitive? In the green steel, is there anything in the legislative outlook that would be helpful to drive this forward?
Well, there are 2 things, probably a few more than 2 things. First, the Biden administration's whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis is a huge driver for us. The commitment they've made for 30 gigawatts by 2030, that's creating a market, a new market for the steel industry. Because remember, particularly in the US, we don't have heavy steel plate that's made specific for our offshore wind foundations. So this is a whole new product line opportunity, and if we start now, we can do that green from the start. But, I think the most critical piece here is they've got to have confidence in the market. I'll give you a few numbers. I'm not a big numbers person, but a few numbers just to make the point. So 1 gigawatt of wind requires 2,000 tons of steel. My company has a commitment, we're in development of 5 gigawatts of steel. So that's 10,000 tons of steel needed just for my company. That's pretty powerful. With the president's ambition of 30 gigawatts, you can see 60,000 tons of steel. If there are steel companies in the United States that want to get in on that, and they want to be part of this net zero movement, what an incredible opportunity. As Varun said, this is what they need. They need security of pipeline. And so obviously the tax incentives that are included that were included in Build Back Better, and I know that many members are still interested in getting those moved. You want a green technology future, that's one of the first things that you do. Second, there's a manufacturing tax credit that's included specifically for the offshore wind industry or in the offshore wind supply chain in the United States. Because remember, this is a brand new industry. We are starting it from scratch. We've got a whole supply chain that we get the opportunity to create. But those investments to build out those product lines need to happen. So there's a manufacturing tax incentive. There's also a shipbuilding tax incentive. All of those things are critically important to drive that investment, get the steel companies, the shipbuilding companies, the support they need to make sure their products are ready when the wind farms are being built. And so we're dedicated to not only the incentives for our own industry, but incentives for the supply chain.
Lauren, anything helpful in the aviation space?
I would offer, right now the conversation for aviation, the devil is in the policy. I mean, it is right now. And so for us, our success is reliant on having access to abundant, cost-effective renewable power for almost every solution we're talking about here. So that's one dependency. We're really appreciative of the all-of-government approach. I think that's a huge demand signal and a powerful mechanism for us to sort of level up the conversation. But specifically within aviation, we're really looking at two different angles here. There is a blender's tax credit that is on the table under the Sustainable Skies Act right now that allows for a performance-based tax credit. So the greater the integrity of that sustainable aviation fuel, meaning the less emissions, the more you get paid. This would provide a signal to the market that we have not had yet in aviation to help sort of bridge the economic divide between other alternative fuels like renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. And that's really important because today, a lot of the producers that could create aviation fuel, they're incentivized, they can make more money making other fuels. So that's a near-term step we can take with policy to level the field so that we can get more supply immediately. The second area that we need to start focusing on is really around net new production. So how do we find the right tax credits, grants, loans to enable new capacity to come online faster and at scale? And that's really important because I'll give you one example. United invested in a company called Fulcrum Bioenergy. Wonderful company. They take trash out of your trash can, they convert it to jet fuel. Really exciting stuff. This was back in 2015 that we made this investment. They're just having their demonstration site go live this year. So that shows you how long it takes for these new production facilities to actually come online and go through all the hurdles of financing as well as the engineering side. So it takes a long time. And right here, we're talking about 2022. This goal is 8 years out. So that's why I keep talking about speed. And we need policy to help us enable both shift in market today and then net new growth for us to hit 2030.
So Varun, sorry to put you on the spot. I know you're not White House led, so we won't ask you to make those predictions, but obviously it's been a bumpy road on this. But what's the outlook for getting some of these incentives passed, and what else are you all trying to accomplish to give policy support to the great leadership that we've had from companies like Ørsted and United?
Thanks, David. And first of all, agree with everything that you both have said. Very well articulated. And as you know, the president of this administration continues to work with Congress toward further ambitious climate action. But let's be clear, what we've got on the books already is plenty impressive. The bipartisan infrastructure law, President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, is sending $62 billion to the Department of Energy. We'll have hydrogen demonstration hubs, $8 billion, funding for carbon capture, carbon removal, industrial decarbonization. And then in addition, the executive actions, you mentioned President Biden's 30 gigawatt offshore wind goal. The president recently, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, announced a major industrial decarbonization set of actions. They include a Buy Clean task force, public procurement, for example. So there's a lot that's been done already. And looking ahead, in addition to the legislative agenda that we just talked about and are all in agreement on, in addition to this, we're working, Secretary Kerry is working with our international partners on policy alignment, again, to make it possible for companies to meet these ambitious purchasing commitments. a few ways to do it. You can have governments sign up to, alongside companies, do public procurement of some of these clean technologies, so we widen the market signal. Second, we can have governments invest in the clean technology supply. And the US government is already committed to doing this. As I mentioned, the Loan Programs Office, led by my colleague Jigar Shah, and other institutions are investing in the technology supply that you can buy. And we're getting our partners around the world, our allies and our partners, are excited to do the same. So around the world, I think we're going to see policy alignment that lines up right behind the advanced market signal that you guys have stepped out and made.
I have to say, Varun, you know when David asks us what policies needed, we're going to go to our wish list. But you are right. I mean, what happened in the first few months of this administration for my industry, first a huge ambition, but then getting the regulatory process moving, everyone has seen that. They've heard it. We feel it. You know, we feel this happening, and you can tell just by the response to the New York Bite opening up new lease area. Everybody wants in on this, you know, exciting new industry. So yeah, a lot has been done already. I love what you're talking about in terms of the international growth, because harmonization of standards is going to be critical. So that's another space that, let us know how to help, because we're with you.
Definitely, definitely.
Terrific. Well, we've talked a lot about green steel and aviation, but you all are working in other sectors. I wonder if you could just kind of give us the headlines. How's it going in the other sectors? Are you seeing good progress?
I'm thrilled. So we've got a shipping sector, for example. Amazon, as I mentioned, but many others as well. Maersk is one of our founding members, has committed to purchase zero emissions ships and fuel. We had the Our Oceans Conference that the United States is co-hosting just next month. And we have a range of exciting announcements on the shipping sector. In trucking, we have fleet operators like cement companies. We also have truckers who, or rather trucking vehicle manufacturers who have joined us, like Scania and Volvo. And finally, we're going to launch 2 new sectors just in the next couple months. One's going to be on aluminum, another's going to be on carbon dioxide removal. And by the end of this year, we'll launch commitments on cement and on chemicals. So by the end of the year, we'll have covered 8 different sectors, 7 hard-to-abate sectors, an 8th one, carbon dioxide removal, that enables any company on planet Earth to join the First Movers Coalition and make a meaningful step toward this 30% emissions today, 50% on business as usual by 2050. So that's kind of where we're headed. Next major set of announcements is going to be at Davos. Again, the World Economic Forum I mentioned is our partner. We're also closely partnered with the Mission Possible Partnership and with Breakthrough Energy, which is Bill Gates's investments in the next generation of these technologies. Again, supplying the technologies that companies can purchase. So it's a big, rich ecosystem that we're hoping to build out this year based on what was announced last year at COP26.
Terrific. Well, some questions from the audience on business case and on cost. So first on business case. So what's the business case for investing in green steel or in sustainable aviation fuel? You know, at first blush, it seems like you're making some investments and it might be more expensive than your competitors, but what's the business case going forward?
Well, I would say for us, we have the benefit of being at the beginning. So again, we start a roadmap. We're working towards not only reducing carbon, but reducing cost. And that's a big issue across the board for renewable energy producers like ours. So it's I mean, we say a long-term approach. We're going to get there, you know, within 8 years' time. It is our commitment. But coming together, having the roadmap written, having other companies join us and do that, you know, joint, purchase power together.
Is it likely to be a big premium? I think one of the audience questions said you'd mention a couple $100, maybe for shipping a car or something like that. But for delivery of wind, and I'll ask you the same question next on the flight, what does this mean for the consumer? Is this likely to be a significant increase in cost?
I'll tell you, the price differential with where we are now is about 5%. It's manageable. I mean, we've got to find other ways to bring down costs, because nobody wants, especially in these economic times, to pay more for energy. So it is always going to be our primary focus, reducing cost of electricity and reducing the carbon footprint.
Great.
Well, I have to say I'm fairly envious of that 5%, because in aviation it's 2 to 4 times the cost of conventional fuel. Now, I will say the crisis in the Ukraine has really helped open some eyes to security around fossil fuel-based industries and having that supply. That's not our driver, though, but I do think it helps inform the business cases around having diversification of your fuel supply. You know, for us, I spend a lot of time talking to our really passionate and thoughtful investor community around what does it mean to decarbonize aviation? Why is it not a linear progression? How can we partner with them in their desire for greater transparency and alignment of metrics in that space to really enable progress that's appropriate? We spend a lot of time talking with our corporate customers. They are staring at their Scope 3 emissions, which is by and large from business travel, or was prior to the pandemic. You know, and they don't know how to partner with us to really affect permanent change. They have been true advocates to really push the industry forward faster. But fundamentally, David, it's the right thing to do. I mean, we recognize that we have a crisis looming. We do impact the temperature rise of this planet. We are a hard to abate industry, and we take responsibility for that. So we are going to continue to invest such that one day we can fly, hopefully no carbon, but certainly low carbon.
But I should correct myself there. 5% difference when it is available. You know, first there's a huge investment that needs to happen to build out these product lines. And that's one area that the Loan Program Office is already looking at. You know, if we want a U.S. supply chain in this area, we do need assistance in getting that started. And we've had people within this administration that are ready to go and ready to help. That's going to be really important, not just for steel, but across the board.
Totally. I'll just make 2 quick points here. The first is I want to underscore that the reason the First Movers Coalition asked companies to devote just a small share of their supply chain is because what we're actually asking companies to do is to take 5 or 10% of their supply chain and devote it to products that initially could be more expensive, as Lauren and as you, Pam, mentioned. And initially, if you only compute the additional cost you're paying, let's say you're paying for a much more expensive sustainable aviation fuel or hydrogen or electric aircraft compared with jet fuel, the cost per ton abated for just that purchase is quite high. $300, $400, $500 a ton. It's a terrible idea, right? But if you compute the catalyzed emission reductions by United or by Ørsted, making this early purchase so that green steel actually becomes more commercially available over time, the cost becomes shockingly low. It is lower than the cost of any offset, setting aside that you're not going to buy offsets, any offset, even a $5 offset, a low integrity offset, it is lower than the cost of that. This is the cheapest thing you can do. The second thing I'll just say, I want to quote one of our CEOs, Anna Borg from Vattenfall, a Swedish utility, who said that the reason that she's investing in the green steel commitment along with Ørsted is that she foresees a world that is moving toward net zero. At some point, she anticipates companies will have to be on board with net zero, whether or not they like it. And fortunately for Vattenfall, they're moving forward now and will get access to supply chains that in the future could become very scarce. Look, we're in a supply chain crisis right now. In the future, as companies scramble for scarce access to those next generation technologies that they'll need to achieve net zero, the first movers that made that first step and got those supplies locked in, they will be competitively very well positioned compared to their peers.
That's right. That's right.
You know, let me ask you a little bit about information sharing, because obviously it's a big world. There are a lot of airlines, there are a lot of steel manufacturers and things like that. How does First Movers propagate this information about developments that are happening in one space around the world, and sort of maybe paint us a little picture of, you know, what's next in terms of the coalition for driving all these industries forward towards decarbonization?
Well, and I'd love to hear from both Ørsted and United on this. We've tried, as we've set up the Secretariat of the First Movers Coalition, again, hosted at the WEF, to keep up a regular cadence of touch points. We meet with our senior experts fairly often. We just had a meeting with our CEOs. Secretary Kerry addressed, as well as Energy Deputy Secretary Dave Turk and the new head, Scott Nathan of the DFC. And we try and keep an open line of communication. We're now going to launch these sectoral focused workshops so that companies that have made the aviation commitment, United, can talk to your customer, Apple, who's also made the commitment, and you guys can share both lessons and strategize on how you're going to get the cost of these premium products down a little bit. So we've tried to set up an infrastructure that allows for information sharing both within the US, but also with our global set of companies. We have Indian companies, for example, that all join these calls and share what's happening in their regional market. So the hope is that we'll keep this cadence up. We'll have annual reporting that comes out at the end of this year and going forward, and that our companies will form a community committed to actually realizing the advanced market commitment. But again, that's from my perspective. I hope that's how you see it too.
Varun, you've absolutely hit it. I mean, we all get our tunnel vision. You know, we've got our goals to hit, and you have to shake us out of our shells. And so this is actually this opportunity to get together. For us, steel, we're not a direct purchaser. We purchase through our supply chain. And so what this is an opportunity to bring everyone together and have us focus on it, and also expand our view. Working with, like, as you said, working with new companies, looking at the market in India, looking at the market in Asia. What are the greater opportunities? Because the biggest if we could get this as large as possible in terms of the commitment, I know the companies will follow.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I respect fully the need for transparency on anything related to decarbonization because there's so much skepticism. I believe that these solutions are going to manifest. I really do. And in fact, I think it's going to be this beautiful, robust marketplace for these low carbon solutions that, Pam keeps talking about for steel as an example. And I'm really excited about that. So fully support the need for transparency and sort of measuring progress. I would caution, as I mentioned earlier, that it is not going to be linear. We're going to see sort of these order of magnitude shifts in the marketplace as some of these solutions mature and scale, as we see some players that may not necessarily be in the first movers join and sort of shift the way that they view the business case and the opportunity presented to them. And so making sure that there is a balance between now and correct is really important, because otherwise we might incentivize the wrong kind of behaviors. So that's one comment. The other is, what I appreciate about first movers is that it does form this community in which we really need, in particular in aviation, the muscle and the resource and the access to all of government. And Varun and I have had many colorful conversations about this, about, really that can help kickstart aviation in a manner that we just haven't seen yet. And so affording us that dialogue to talk about the ecosystem that supports aviation decarbonizing is so critically important right now. And so I'm really excited to have these sort of sector-based dialogues with an eye towards sort of that broader community that needs to sort of support it, because like I mentioned, we're not successful until the power sector actually greens. And so there's all those dependencies across the entire orbit of decarbonization that I think first movers can really help inform.
Terrific. While we're on transparency, one of the questions we got from the audience was, the company's, net zero by 2050 targets. How do you know those are real? Are you having external verification of it? I've heard, Scott talk about, offsets are nice, but that's not how we're going. So how do you demonstrate to the marketplace the credibility of your 2050 target?
Yeah, that's a very fair question, and thank you whoever submitted that question. So we also have a 2035 goal, and our 2035 goal for United Airlines is around carbon intensity. So we are committing to reducing our carbon intensity 50% by 2035 compared to 2019. So we recognize now what's important about that is that we've contracted a lot because of the coronavirus circumstances and the impact on aviation. We will be growing, but what we want to do is grow responsibly with an eye towards sustainability and an investment in decarbonization so that we can become an airline that offers flyers the opportunity to fly carbon-free one day. That's our vision. And so for us, we recognize the need to have nearer term targets. That goal is backed by science. It aligns with the goals of the Paris Agreement. That's very important to us that we have credibility. Now, I get the question all the time, what about a 2022 goal or a 2023 goal? That's not going to happen. But what we can do is continue to build the portfolio of solutions that enable us to understand, because the last thing I want to do is make a commitment on behalf of truly aviation at large, and we don't succeed, because that will then pull us back by years. And we cannot afford that. Right now, we just have to keep going, investing in the right solutions. Hopefully they come to market faster. Hopefully the policies are there and the whole ecosystem supports success, and then we can actually commit to a nearer term target.
And for Ørsted, we've been on this journey for a bit longer, and For us, science-based targets. And we're really proud that we were the only energy company that was actually certified by the Science Based Targets Initiative this year. That was really meaningful to us because we have been working at this for a long time. We want to be a representative, a role model of a company to show that it can be done. But we can't all define it in our own ways. And so that's what we all were doing until there were these science-based targets that we could align to. We were delighted that we were validated by those, but I think it's really important. Otherwise, we're all susceptible to being greenwashing, and that's not what this is about. And it's certainly not going to get us to the goals that we have for our own net carbon goals, as well as our supply chain. So science-based targets, big deal.
Varun, you've worn a lot of hats. You were, an investor and entrepreneur before you were working in government. So I want to ask you about sort of the investment community intersection with this field. I mean, is the investment community rewarding these kinds of investments? Are there things that could happen or policies that could change that would create a more positive investment climate for rewarding companies that invest in this kind of space?
Honestly, I did not pay him to ask the question, but it's dead on because last week Secretary Kerry made a visit to Silicon Valley, where we talked with a range of clean tech investors as well as companies, everywhere from startup to growth to public companies, all developing the clean tech solutions of the future. I'm going to give you a few examples. These are companies like 12 developing ways to take captured carbon, combine it with green hydrogen, and produce drop-in replacements for jet fuel that would really achieve net zero carbon jet fuel. These are companies that are doing hydrogen aviation, companies that are taking renewable energy that Ørsted could produce and storing it in these massive thermal energy batteries or chemical energy batteries like Forum Energy or Enervenue. Range of companies, super exciting. And we are right now at an inflection point. I hate using that word incorrectly, but
very popular around here.
It's like a term from calculus. But the point we're at right now, $147 billion, Bloomberg reports, was invested in climate tech from VCs, institutional investors, and corporates in 2021. Smashed the record. We're emerging from a decade in the desert in clean tech investing after the major crash of clean tech 1.0. And climate tech 2.0 has emerged now as hopefully a much more stable and exciting asset class. So I think right now is a perfect time for investors to get into the market. They're already investing liberally in these solutions. Public policy, we're trying to keep pace, right? The policy advances that have made this market what it is today will have to continue to enable that boom in investment in the next generation of solutions to keep growing. And that's why we in government work so hard to make it possible for that next generation technology, whether it's a clean fertilizer production or, as we were talking about, long duration storage or clean steel, when that gets to market, the policies have to be in place so that that innovator can get even more investment in the billions of dollars. Jigar Shah talks about $100 billion for each of these emerging verticals, each of these promising technologies. And so we're working hard to make sure that we stay caught up with what is probably the most exciting place to be in the investment world right now, except for, Web3.
Well, and I'll offer to that. I mean, at United, last year we stood up United Ventures, which is our own venture fund specifically with a priority focus area of alternative fuels and these advanced technologies. That would not have happened 5 years ago. And this week, there's right here in town, there's an alternative fuels conference where our venture fund is actually going to speak, which is so interesting and such a development in sort of how we're bridging these relationships that just didn't exist before. The flip side is I spend a ton of time talking to investors, whether it's ESG investment or GFANs with some of the commitments made at Glasgow, around how can they enable through their resources and investing success in these hard to abate industries. So it's just fascinating to see these bridges being built, all for the good of driving these solutions forward in a faster way.
And for Ørsted, profitability and sustainability go hand in hand. It is our brand. We've been through the transformation and it has proven out. We have been rewarded for going this route. And, it's exciting to be there, and it's exciting to see others.
Great news. Lauren, some questions from the audience. Supersonic, aircraft, is that a thing? Electric airplanes, is that a thing? And if so, how many are you buying?
Yes, and hydrogen too. So it's kind of fun. I mean, I feel like a science nerd sometimes because there's all of these laboratory experiments of sorts. But yes, absolutely. So, practically speaking, let's start with electric and hydrogen. We invested in a couple of electric aircraft manufacturers, whether it's eVTOL, so vertical takeoff and landing, or a 9 to 12 seater, or a little bit larger than that. The question becomes sort of the capacity of the battery and how much storage it can hold, such that the airplane's able to propel forward. So there's a lot of focus on that. What's exciting for United is that it does allow us to sort of expand the kind of services, if we're thinking about an electric vertical takeoff and landing that can get you from downtown DC out to Dulles, right? So that would be extremely fun if we could do it carbon-free. So there's an eye to that. Varun mentioned earlier we have an investment in ZeroAvia, which allows us to retrofit existing aircraft that use fossil fuel-based jet fuel with a hybrid between a hydrogen and electric engine. So that allows us to keep our existing assets that fly in the sky for 30 years, but use them more responsibly. I mean, that's super exciting. And if we get more of those solutions to come on board, thumbs up. Supersonic, time is money, although, our commitment is to really drive the sustainable aviation fuel market forward so that we're flying SAF on that supersonic aircraft. I think we need to be eyes wide open that innovation is going to continue to happen. My commitment is to make sure United does it responsibly, and we absolutely will. And you'll see that across the board in all of the commitments we make around decarbonization.
Perfect. Really interesting question from the audience on the customer. So First Movers is focused on companies, but is there a way to leverage customer demand for green steel, for sustainable aviation fuel to help drive this? And then Pamela, I'm going to come to you next to see, you all are in the bid world. Is there anything that can happen in that space to, because they are the customers in a sense, to have them incentivize it? But first, Varun.
It's a really great question. So again, we've started with our companies joining the First Movers Coalition. You can imagine, we talked earlier about the limited cost that gets passed on to consumers in the cost of a product. A car that has green steel has a couple $100 increase in cost. Jeans that are shipped on clean shipping of a dollar, a couple cents increase. Companies can eat the cost. That would be them investing in driving down the green premium, or they could pass on the cost. Theoretically, they could even pass on more of the cost, or more than the cost, because these products would have, they'd be part of the First Movers Coalition. And consumers, particularly discerning consumers who want to take climate action, may be willing to pay a premium. So that may be another reason why enterprising companies can make the most of the competitive advantage from this institution. The way to implement this going forward is to try and give consumers some choice. Already there are some areas, aviation's one of them, where on some flights, if you book a flight, you can choose to offset your emissions. You can imagine in the future you might have the choice to offset your emissions, not in the traditional offset kind of way, that's kind of a dirty word, but rather by buying products that are First Movers Coalition, through the First Movers Coalition. So for example, buying a flight that uses a fuel that actually qualifies for this extraordinarily stringent threshold of the First Movers Coalition. Similarly, you might buy products that are shipped via, Amazon's one of our companies, shipped via one of these companies that has met the commitment for 5 or 10% of their supply chain. In the case of power, you could be, I guess down the road, a customer of Ørsted, which remarkably is not only producing clean power, but is looking even further upstream to reduce their supply chain emissions. It's like, a double whammy of commitment to decarbonization. So that's how I think we might get the customer involved in understanding the choices that they make and how those choices don't just reduce emissions today. Again, this is an expensive way to reduce emissions today. It's how customers can catalyze emission reductions for decades in the future by investing in innovation, which is what the companies are already doing and what customers could get exposure to.
And then for offshore wind, government is the customer. So it is the states that are driving these investments. They're creating OREX PPAs to buy the power. And when you look at those RFPs that come out, they already have a lot of non-price factors. Non-price factors that have driven a lot of really, in my opinion, great behavior. Factors like using organized labor, factors like investing in environmental justice communities. Could they have a factor that includes, decarbonizing your supply chain, using, near zero? We know net zero isn't, we're not there yet still. I'd love to look at a realistic timeline to do that and to have those factors built in. Absolutely.
We're almost at the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal balls for a little bit of a prediction, because there's so many headwinds going on right now. There's the crisis in Ukraine, there's an energy crisis, there's inflation, and so it's not a time of great optimism in the world. But I want to ask you to get out your crystal ball, and I'll give you the last word, Varun, because I know you'll be optimistic because you're perpetually optimistic. But sort of 2030, where do you think we're going to be on the sustainable aviation fuel space and on the green both the green energy and the green steel space?
Well, I'll gladly start. I think we will see a multitude of producers come online for aviation. I think we'll see demand skyrocket from airlines like us. I think we'll see a variety of technologies and feedstocks that are going to enable this transition. I'm hopeful that we have a green power sector that is abundant and accessible for all of the industries to have access to enable these clean climate tech solutions to come on board. I hope we're far beyond 5%, frankly. I have to counsel myself not to leapfrog the current solutions in celebration of the future solutions, but I believe the future is going to be where aviation is carbon free. Won't be by 2030, but I do think we can bypass the 5% if we have all the right resources, investments, speed, and desire to really push it forward. We also can't afford not to move because of our investor communities are demanding action, our customers are demanding action. It's the right thing to do. So we will be in it. I think we'll be successful. I am an optimist too. I suppose everyone in sustainability and decarbonization has to be. But I'm really excited to see the type of innovation that's coming to market today and what it can enable for the future.
Great. Emily, your lightning round response?
Yeah, so for us, I don't need a crystal ball for 2030. By 2030, we have committed to purchasing 50% of our steel from steel companies that are using science-based targets to meet their net zero steel commitments. So that's on the board. If I look at my crystal ball, what I hope I'm seeing is that we reach that 30 by 2030 goal for offshore wind. Clearly, the demand is there, the interest, the industry is excited about this. We've seen that with the new entrants, and we want to continue building it out.
Vern?
Well, again, the two spheres. One sphere, in 2030, we will see lower emissions around the world than we see today. And that will be driven largely by the deployment of existing technology solutions, solar, wind, batteries, et cetera. In the other sphere, by 2030, my optimistic crystal ball is we will see the groundwork laid for decades of future deployment of these emerging technologies. That means not only the scale up of these technologies, we're talking about the production of next generation SAFs, the production of truly green steel, not just low carbon steel, but in addition, the associated infrastructure. We'll see green shipping corridors. The Quad countries are already working on that, for example, with the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And so the infrastructure, the electric vehicle charging corridors for heavy-duty freight between major city pairs, we'll see all of this groundwork being laid. They won't have made a dent in global emissions. I want to be absolutely clear on that. But they will have laid the possibility for us to do that in the 2030s and the 2040s. And that is what's going to be required that's what's required for 50% roughly of emissions reductions to get to our climate goals in 2050. So it's just as important as the emission reductions we achieved this decade.
Terrific. Well, thank you. And I wanted to end on a note of optimism, so thank you all. And thank you all so much for joining us today for this fascinating conversation. And thanks especially to our panelists for taking the time. I also want to thank Kelsey Foran, Juan Gomez, Zeynep Wilronen, and Andrea Klebo for their help in putting together today's session. Please join us again on Friday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern for Unearthing Potential, the Value of Geothermal Energy to U.S. Decarbonization. We're also gearing up for the 6th Annual Global Energy Forum at the end of this month. You can find more details on the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center website And thanks so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.